Okay, so good afternoon. I am Anteo Buriarjo. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday afternoon to try and figure out what the future is like for the smart building industry. In case you are wondering who we are listed on mondaylive.org, the site where you registered for this webinar. Just a reminder that views expressed here are personal, not of any company or organization. And please do post questions, comments on the Zoom chat. Make this as interactive as we possibly can. And in case you want any of the information that's on this deck, it is also available on mondaylive.org right there on the homepage. So welcome, glad you can be with us today. So over the course of February of this year, we're going to be talking about operational technology, and specifically operational technology not in the context of OT and IT sort of debate that we've been having, but more on the actual technology necessary to operate a building sort of structure. But we'll get to talking about that a lot more. Our agenda, we're going to be looking at the operational technology and really sort of asking the question, what actually makes a well-operated building? We've actually talked about it last week. I think several of us were saying, we've come across buildings that are obviously well operated. They were done that way, not by accident. They were done there on purpose. So what makes a building like that? So see where that takes us. But before we get into that, Ken, what's going on?
Thank you very much. It's a great intro because what last week did is it got us all thinking about that operation. The OS falls on basically the operator and how well the building is operated. And that brought up a bunch of stories from the past that I shared. And it got me thinking about a document that we had actually prepared way back when in 2022 with Engineered Systems, and we were talking about the idea that the facility operations, and we created a supplement that was a pullout from the Engineered magazine, and we started sharing some ideas. I got thinking about that article because we put a lot of work into it, and so I went back and grabbed the article. I pulled it into my editor, and I changed the word web to cloud. And then I had Grammarly go through and work its magic. And all of a sudden, this thing came out, and it starts to read with a lot of good information about what is required for building operation. Then when I was finished with that, I basically ran the Copilot and did an AI rewrite of it. So it was a pretty easy effort to do this. And I do think that the document is of value. Again, inside of that document is the words at an after-dinner talk at BACnet seminar on October 24th, 1996. Concluded my talk with the following summary. I predict that we will see the separation of the vendor's involvement in graphics and data presentation. Either internet or intranet type HTML multi-platform anywhere presentation will become the standard. This will allow the data to be easily organized into common non-proprietary presentation application. So you can see I had a vision. We keep getting closer to it, but God, guys, that's a lot of years that we've been talking about this. In addition to that, that led to some as I started digging through the archives, started taking a look at another article we'd written, Are Automated Buildings Converging or Colliding? And I think that subject is back on the table again. And at the bottom it says, is our industry listening to the wake-up call from the information revolution? 1999 presentation to the Golden Gate, San Jose, ASHRAE chapters. And then I went to Chicago and I ran into these OGs, these original gangsters of automated buildings. And they're on the far left is Ben's son, who was then with Flaxen Kirk, and was also the president of the ASHRAE chapter, and has been a great supporter of the things I say. And we basically worked on a few projects down there. And of course, my original contributing editor, Tom Hartman, and these two guys are still there, still trying to get some of this stuff out. It's a tough sell, but I think it is worthwhile to point out that we've visited all of this before. Anto and I were just having a quick talk before the meeting, and Anto pointed out that it's not exactly the same, because what we were talking about was basically using the web to enable better facility operations. And with cloud native, that can be much more powerful. But for it to be much more powerful, we need to understand how a super operator would actually operate the building in the best he knew how. And then I think we can augment it with the information we can pull from the information age. Anyway, I just found it an interesting transition back, and I think it is actually worth a read. Especially take a look at some things like the identification of a super operator, the training that is necessary. Running these buildings is complex. It's you got to know a lot of technologies to make them move, and I think that is still true. And I'm thinking that we're losing that expertise, and I'm not sure that we have a place where we can teach our AI to be good operators. Back to you. Enough said. Back to you, Anto.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. So is our industry listening to the wake-up call, the information revolution? Obviously, the answer is yes, but slowly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, we have done a lot since 1996, to be fair. I mean, there was no web, and now everything is web, right? We don't do anything that's not web. And you look at, things like fault detection diagnostics and the tools that we've developed and the data that we're mining using those sort of tools. There has been a lot. We don't want to dismiss all the work. I mean, look at the work that Jim Lee has done with Symetrics and the analytics that he's got out there. So, I think significant stuff has been done. I think we're on a path, right, a roadmap, and really the question is are we moving fast enough along those paths?
But I think one big missing hole is we don't really have a good method of training our facility operators. I look at that, and that's always been my life, was training these folks. And we created a course for high performance building operators, HyperOps. And we had, at the point, we had 80 people in that at one time. And it had a whole network. They shared ideas. That's still necessary. And actually some of the, in the ashes of automated buildings, was that desire to recreate an operating team. And I think that requirement is still there. And anybody that has any ideas how to do that, it's
To be fair,
But
I
fine.
think
Roger has already accomplished this in the UK. It has a much more sophisticated regime. What we need to do is copy what he's done over there.
yeah, the training apprenticeship thing's really gaining momentum here now. But the other thing I was thinking about was that surely once the building's up and running, a lot of this falls down to the facility management companies and stuff, who should, in theory, have huge expertise, because that's what they do for a living. Do those skills, they run the buildings, they look after the systems. Is it not their job also to actually, manage the facilities, whether it's remotely or on-prem?
To operate the facilities. That's exactly their job, right? Right.
Exactly.
But
they should, in theory, have lots of experience, because they do that, for a living.
So, but one problem we have is that we talked about on Wednesday is we have this turnover of basically mechanical systems that are designed for empty buildings that don't have people in them. Then the people come into the building, the requirements change, in a building that's leased. They have no idea who's going to even lease the space. We have those changes. We have basically the original design errors that go with that building forever. that are the tails that wag the dog that an operator has to deal with on a daily basis. So that whole side of it is, it says that operations has to have a stronger input into the whole equation, in my mind. And I've always worked in that camp where the people I'm working for are only one or two from the president or the CEO of the company to make this stuff work. So it's a big difference if you look at it from an operating point of view.
I
I
think,
guess, Ken, also the REITs have a desire to make the building easily manageable or stuff, because again, that's what they do for a living now, and nobody really owns buildings anymore. Everybody leases them. So it's the people who actually own the buildings who've got to make it attractive to bring in the people who are going to occupy it. So you'd have thought they have some responsibility here to actually design or request the design at least, to actually and know what a building requires for it to actually run on afterwards.
For the operation.
well,
Yeah.
if you want to look at the link that I just posted in, I think technology, just like you used, Ken, here in your actual article here, you said you used Copilot AI to rewrite your article. That's going to be one of the directions that are going to replace a lot of these facility guys, right? And have a look at Microsoft's video that I just pitched and put in the
Chat.
chat there.
Mm.
Take a look at that. That's good. That's kind of mine eye-opening.
All right, let's move on. We'll come back to talking about operations. Obviously, that's the topic of the day. So continuing on our sort of slides, I had a couple of things. On the left is something that I brought up 2 or 3 weeks back. This is this new Wi-Fi that goes for like 3 kilometers, and they've actually did a test on this a couple of weeks back in San Francisco, and they actually had Wi-Fi extend for 3 kilometers, which is quite amazing if you think about it. And especially for LoRaWAN, I think LoRa is going to LoRa's probably the target of this by Wi-Fi. Going to try and sort of replace LoRa, or sort of make it less attractive. So I think this is very interesting, and also for a building, 3 kilometers is obviously way over what you actually need for a building. So everything in a building is within 3 kilometers. So it's within one access point, although I'm sure there's other things you have to consider. So that's interesting. And the other article that I found is about data economy. And we keep on talking about who owns the data and controlling the data and all of this kind of stuff. This article is talking about one aspect, one concept that people seem to be ignoring, which is the data subject. In other words, you may have a piece of data, right? And you may argue that that was created by the building owner or the system or the analytics. But if it's about Ken Sinclair, then Ken Sinclair is the subject of that piece of data. So shouldn't he be somehow involved in how that data is governed? And it could be a person, or it can actually be a thing. So just the concept of the data actually pertains to something is what this article is talking about. So just thought that was an interesting angle. So that's my thing on the Smarter Summit. The video is obviously up there for you to watch if you want to do that. And we're all sort of looking forward to Smarter Summit in Tampa in June. More info about that will follow in a few weeks. A normal link board. And anything else anybody want to bring up before we pile into operations some more?
Actually, just to comment on the Wi-Fi, which I applaud, that's great. We had a situation here in our local area where we had a cable company that who basically got into the cell phone business, and what they were doing is basically your cell phone was zero, you just bought your data, and they basically anywhere you were in one of their Wi-Fi ranges, you used your cell phone over Wi-Fi. And so what's happened is the cell phone companies basically have squished them out and bought them. And the Canadian government let them do that, which I disagree with. But anyway, and the reason is they had a strong presence in the West, but not a strong presence in the East. But anyway, the bottom line is there's this fight going on that the cell companies are not wanting to lose that, because that is incredibly significant. If all of the people in the building can actually use Wi-Fi and don't need a cell, so there's a war going on there.
Although the bandwidth that this Wi-Fi LoHa does is actually not huge. It's 1 meg, which is plenty for applications like controls, but obviously is only a tiny amount that users would actually use. So it's not really targeted at users. It's more for IoT. Yeah, okay. There's nothing else, operational technology. So the question is kind of, I just threw this up as a sort of as a way for us to think about it. We've all sort of have come across or have worked on projects where the building was obviously constructed and it's being operated really well, and it was planned that way, right? So I think the task for today is that what makes those kinds of buildings that way? Why are they like that? Why are they not the norm? Why aren't all buildings like that? Why is it just the exception? It seems to be. And that's really sort of the discussion. I know, Ken, that you had your experience back in the 80s or in the 90s that you talked about on Wednesday. You want to share a little bit more about how that came about and why that doesn't happen today?
Well, as I mentioned, I've always kind of come at this from an operations point of view, and the original DDC project I was involved in 1975 was at a university, and the person driving the process was identified as the energy manager for the campus, and he answered directly to the president of the university, and I worked for that department, and we basically were banned with the task of not only inventing DDC, but actually fixing the failed systems and fixing a whole bunch of design problems that were inherent. And analytics and stuff became significant to us, and we all understood, we all believed that. So just the level at which operations comes in is huge. Then I moved to BC, and I was working for the British Columbia Building Corporation, which was a Crown corporation. And a similar situation as the person I was working for was at a director level and answered directly to the president of the Crown Corporation. So it's just a matter of, is operations important to you or not? And the people I worked with, they said, yep, it's important. It's cardinal. It's what we do. We provide good operations for our buildings. And yeah.
I think what Ken's saying is kind of interesting, right? Because my experience of, if you were to, what makes these well-operated buildings, I've always found there's always been one key person, right? Whether that's Ken or somebody like that, there's been one key folk who's really driven getting the building there in the first place, right? And you could probably go through our industry and name names, like people like Daryl Smith at, Microsoft as an example, right? There's always, from my perspective, there's always seems to be one champion of an organization who really drives and has a vision and has a sort of a plan to make these things well operated and well successful. And then they seem to become what's the word, highly sought after that too, right? Once they kind of do one, they tend to move on to the next challenge or the next big organization. So to me, that's always been one of the key factors, right? Is there someone who's got, from the client side or owner side? Is there someone who's got the vision? So, you know, one of the projects we did in Singapore, same, you know, there was one guy who was the visionary of what was being done and drove everybody to get to that objective. More so, and then all of these things tended to flow, you know, from that visionary guy. And I've always made it my mission to find that guy, right? Does he exist? Or girl.
Which is really behind bullet number 2, right?
Yeah.
Is what the owner asking for. It's not really what the owner is asking for, but who that person is.
Yeah.
It's just as important as what he or she is asking for.
One thing we identified early in this whole process is that training was cardinal, and basically you get the vision, and if everybody is in agreement with the vision, then we have to train all of the people underneath us. And basically what happened is, in a lot of ways, I'm one of those people that was underneath that sort of rose up through the system, as did all my peers, and they've all gone scattered all over the earth, but they all have that same common background. We also all grew up in energy simulation, which was the early digital twin back in those days, and we understood more than the average operator. Understood controls, understood utilities, large flows, and things like that. But the secret that we found, especially in the BCBC organization, was to basically push that back and turn it into significant training. We spent like a big bucks on training, and like I say, we got up to 85 folks looking after 700 buildings. We would drag them together, and I don't think that's done enough. I don't think anybody puts that kind of focus on operations.
I think these are great points that have been made already. I'd like to take a slightly different slice at it. Even if you are empowered from the top and you have your key guy, what we've discovered over time is that there's an organizational behavior problem in terms of the way that maintenance facility departments are structured, not only funded. But if you have, for instance, a group that is in charge of energy and they're in a different silo than the group that is responsible for maintenance, we get basically conflict of interest. And the people that need to spend the money to save the energy are often in a different group with a different budget. So we end up with competing silos instead of cooperating silos. We even saw this in the military years ago. They've tried to make strides to fix that. But I think that how groups are set up. Another example would be historically, when we look at heating, ventilating, and air conditioning, at large customers that we have, pipe fitters would be the ones that were responsible for fixing these things. So I won't name the names, but there's a large university here in Boston, and that university had, 300,000 points of DDC. But when something broke, the way that the unions and the place was set up, the pipe fitters got called. They went out, ascertained that they couldn't do anything because the only thing they could do was a steam trap. Then they would go back, and then the controls contractor would have to be called. So depending on who's actually there and the institutional behavior over long periods of time, you can get a lot of dysfunction in these organizations that are just management 101 that haven't been worked through. And often finance is overlaid. The way finance is structured in terms of maintenance, operating, capital, energy, those things often don't align very well.
So I got to amplify Jim's point. I love that point because we found exactly the same, Jim, is that in my early days, again, 5-10 years ago, in this space, to your point, the disconnect within the client was so self-evident to us, but interestingly enough, wasn't self-evident to themselves. And
Right.
that was one of our aha moments back when that, we'd walk in and they'd start discussing and you'd be talking with different groups, and it became quickly clear that they weren't internally aligned And then the other thing we found was that they had no real tool to actually align themselves, right? They all had their own missions when some was, to your point, some was energy, some was operations, some was tenant issues, you know, and we found that they really didn't have a good way of understanding that they themselves had different missions and objectives. They did at the highest level, but when you drill down to trying to help them and provide them with a solution or a program or an operations or whatever, it started to break apart and they couldn't really negotiate between themselves, was one of the things that we found. So we kind of built some tools over time when we got into that sort of situation to highlight more, not dysfunction, but the disconnect internally that they had. And they had to overcome those challenges first before we could actually start to help them.
Spot on, Anno. And, you know, the key is that in other silos in the business, you know, the management consultants have already swept through and reprogrammed.
Yeah.
It's just they haven't gotten down to us in the janitorial closet.
Right.
Because once again, we're not considered core part of the business, right?
Right.
If we were core, we would have already had a 23-year-old from McKinsey telling us what to do. Maybe we should consider ourselves lucky.
Yeah, you're probably right. Well, actually, that's a really good point because you're probably right, because I've seen some of those that have managed to get down to that level and it was a disaster in its own right.
Exactly.
Right.
They were lucky.
One of our biggest problems was the utility in the university, because the utilities in a large university operates just like a utility does. And they think like a utility does, and they don't believe they're part of the university. And that was a bloody fight. And in the final analysis, we had to take them down because that was the only way we could achieve the building operations that we needed to achieve. So it was a big fight, and having that short connection to the top, we were closer connected to the top than they were, so we were able to kind of win them over, as it were. But anyway, that's a yes, a real concern.
So what is the last bullet question that I have up there? The financial picture of that kind of situation.
Anto, if you don't mind, before we jump into that, can I go back to the first question, specified and procured?
Okay.
Okay, so one of the things I observed when I was doing more of my cybersecurity area was that the typical MEP, right, had little or no skills in that area. And they were relying on, you know, a provider like I was to help define the requirements for cybersecurity, and which is fine. But my point here is a more general one, which is I view MEPs, consulting engineers, whatever phrase you want to use, as being hired to define functional requirements to get the building to run. Okay, so it's very, in other words, how much capacity of HVAC and of what type do I need, given the kind of facility it is. Similarly, on the electrical side, with regard to lighting, and then fire and life safety, what do I need to do to comply with whatever the restrictions are or the regulations are within the space? I don't believe, and that's why I wanted to bring this up for a conversation, I don't believe that these consultants sit down with the owner and talk about operational issues in the design of what they put together, because they certainly weren't, you know, comfortable or able to do that on the cybersecurity side. And my guess is they're not doing it on these other areas as well. So they're in a very strong position to ask the owner and suggest to the owner what would be valuable from an operations perspective, but that's not what they're getting paid to do. And their fees are pretty much capped and constrained to where if they had meaningful conversations in those areas, they're likely not to conduct them because they're not going to get paid for it. So that's what I'm positing as an argument here, and I'm curious what everybody else thinks.
I want to jump right in on that one, and you're absolutely right, Steve, because that's exactly the problem. And we ran into that really quickly. And the other thing with evolving technology, which we were involved with DDC that hadn't been invented yet, the idea of turning that over to the mechanical consultant was just a disaster. So what we did is we actually removed the controls directly out of the construction process and carried it as a prime sum. And we ran a request for proposal for automation. The other observation we made is the average construction time was like 3 to 4 years, which meant that if they actually did find the best system at the time, by the time they got it on site, it was totally obsolete. So we basically pulled that out, and we came up in the early 90s with the first online DDC manual that they would actually specify their products, and they would choose a graphic and a control strategy for each one of their products and or each one of their systems. And that was we laid out the mechanical or the automation system for them, and we renamed it to the client comfort system, because that's what we thought it was. It's not an energy management system. And so that document was a landmark document, and could have never been created without that close relationship between
With the owner.
a president or a CEO wanting to identify with something.
I think it goes back that the top three to me are kind of, when you look at it, everybody else in there is transitional except for the owner. You know, whether it's the consultant who, you know, traditionally is only cut and paste the spec anyway, and the mechanical contractor who's trying to do the job for less, and then you're handing over, and there's split within perhaps the demand for the FM guys because they, you know, or anybody who's looking after the building, because their contract could only be for 2 or 3 years anyway, so they're not 100% committed to it. The owner is key to this, and I am hopeful that with the change of what we've seen through COVID and other things where, yeah, you know, there's going to be a lot of changes in buildings, but that means leases will be shorter, and so the owner, or should I say the occupier, will actually be demanding better buildings to be in. And I think the people who learn from that hopefully will be the REITs who are actually own the buildings, when it comes to office buildings anyway, to ensure that what is being provided. And I think it goes back, I think, to what Anna was saying, or Jim, I can't remember, but was actually saying that wherever the owner's been involved, that one person, you know, that Anna was talking about is the guy who can drive it through. And I think, to my mind, a lot of the people like REITs and building owners now are actually bringing those people in because they recognize perhaps that the contractual chain leading up to what they may get may not be what they need afterwards.
But who are they bringing in, Roger? I mean, on the surface, the logical piece, they're either going to go to the suppliers directly for something
They're
like
going out to the
automation.
industry, and they're picking really good people from controls companies or maintenance companies, you know, people who actually do know about some of this stuff. They only got 1 or 2 in a large organization.
Yeah.
But these guys are given the power to actually say, this is what a specification should look like. And yet, you know, you will make sure that BIM is integrated into the solution and other things like that, because that's what they're actually thinking about, protecting their long-term interests as well as any occupier coming in.
But what you're saying is that someone at the owner level has to have that 1 or 2 people who know what to ask, what is required. And so what do you do? What does our industry do when those 1 or 2 people don't exist, or they have limited skills?
Well, I think the bigger guys like the REITs can afford these people and can poach them.
Yep.
You know, because they will take them because they're big enough. They are multi-billion-dollar companies, and can convince them and pay them enough to actually get them to come in and sit as that. You know, the SIs are doing a little bit of this, not much, because they're again only involved in that. They're helping the owners, and they're helping a few other people because they do have some knowledge either side. But there are people being taken from the industry now and joining people like the REITs. And I think, you know, sometimes it's people who are in the retail industry, or it's others are actually saying, we know we've got to have someone to protect our all our assets out there and make sure they're worth, you know, running and financially feasible afterwards.
Yeah, you know, you say that, Roger, and I have 2 active senior role recs open at the moment that I can't seem to
Right.
fill, because I am, to your point, I am literally going to
You are the man.
the industry, to the industry to get those sort of resources, and you know, they are still few and far between.
Sure.
So if anybody knows anybody, by the way, I'm not.
Yeah,
So let's jump to the financial picture. Does that come in to this? I mean,
I
not
think,
sure it does.
well, I don't know if it's the financial picture or more back to Jim's point, which I always line up with, is what the business model, right? What's the business model that you put together for this thing? That's still always the challenge, right? At the end of the day, and to be honest, you know, even if you do find the right guy, and even if that guy has got the, you know, the character and the style to be able to push something through and make something significant. And again, I'll use Daryl Smith as a good example, right? Even he, you know, still has challenges getting the business model right, you know, for a company like a large company. So I think that's still a critical factor, right? Is you could have the vision, you could have the right technologies, you could have the right drive, you might have the right folks, but can you, back to Jim's always point, you know, can you put an internal business model together that will get the attention of someone, you know, in the organization to make it work?
To deal with all the conflicts that are internal.
Always, right? It's always your budget versus everybody else's budget that you're trying to promote. So
Yeah.
You know, you need strong characters to be able to articulate that well.
You know, and the way I think about it is that in most higher level business management functions, you get people that are quite adept politically and from a management sense.
Right.
And you know, who do we have as the VP of facilities? Basically somebody that worked their way up by keeping their head down. You know, it's not a skill set that lends itself to asking for money well. You know, VP of facility has quite a large budget, but almost no flexibility in that budget.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not necessarily the VP of facilities fault. It's how the VP of facility is viewed by the rest of the organization that colors this.
Yeah, and I think it's always under pressure, that budget as well. Each year it's always like, do you really need this many people, right? And he has to justify it constantly because it's always under scrutiny. That is something I think that's changing a little bit though. I do sense there's a lot of interest at the building owner level about how can technology help me reduce that cost and dependency on people.
Yeah.
Facility.
Right, but I think there's also the time frame, and this is you know, varies radically between vertical market. Right, higher education's going to own its buildings for 300 years. REIT's going to own its buildings for 7 years.
Right,
and you know, depending on the model and where you are, that doesn't mean that, you know, I think a lot of places in higher education, even though they're going to own those assets for a long time, still run everything to failure, right? Yeah. Because once again, it's really hard to ask for money for preventive maintenance or even predictive maintenance or any maintenance rather than running to failure. Because if the roof's not leaking right now, you know, why fix it now? Right? There's so many other demands on the cash. And although I think that's true for a lot of other parts of the business, our parts of the business are not looked at as core to the mission of the business. So they get last dibs on the money.
Yeah. Another thing I'd like to point out is once you once you actually do get that budget, if you do have the support from the top and you do get that budget, and you start getting the maintenance and facility operations up to where it should be, then you get picked off by the outsourcers who basically come in and take it low ball because they're not doing the same service as you are. And that typically what happened in the BCBC model is they basically eventually they took it back into the government, and then they basically farmed it all out, and they don't provide anywhere near the same services, but they're less bucks. So
Interesting to
that's another problem.
Be interesting to see how the Google folks get on, because they have quite a strong team in certainly the construction phase, and they've got high-level consultants engaged. They got MSIs. They got strong people within the organization dedicated to that first line. Specifying and procuring. And I don't know. I mean, the buildings, a lot of them, like the one in the UK now, which is the European headquarters, and the ones they've been looking after or changing in the US. What will happen afterwards? Because they're obviously keen to look after their staff, because they are their most important asset. And so I think they're looking at how do we keep our people, and one of the things they're keen to do is actually make sure that the environment they work in is good. But it'd be interesting to see after now they've kind of deployed a lot of the stuff, how the maintenance will continue on in terms of the financial aspect, because they clearly had it at the beginning.
So guys, I want to point out that trying to make owners smarter or consultants smarter from an operational perspective is out of our control largely. It's a nice conversation. We can make here are the benefits if you have the right talent to ask the right questions and specify the right products and services. But that's about as far as we can take it. Largely as a group here, we are more on the product side, and we spend a lot of time talking about things like the IBB and how to specify, and so that's where we have a sense of control. That's where we can influence. And so the more we can do to continue to do what we're doing to make it possible to run buildings more efficiently through technology, where that we then enable whether the REIT uses a facility management firm, or they use a MSI or some other service organization to help them in this regard, or they do it in-house with their own talent. The more we can do to make the systems interoperable and easy to get the information from, easy to do the analytics on all the data that's there, where that's something we can to a large extent control, and thereby we're enabling operations to be improved for those organizations that bring in either the talent internally or hire the talent externally to get it done. And so I say we continue to focus and have these discussions around the things that we have some control over, which is the products themselves.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Steve. And that, to me, kind of addresses that. I don't know what number it is, the one about scale in their operations, right? That's how can products and technologies help them scale their operations, which is kind of what seems to be the most sensitive piece of their costs and operations and stuff. And technology can directly affect that.
Yeah. Exactly.
But what's interesting to me, and this exercise is supposed to be not asking the question, what should we do to make it more operated, be better operated, but what has actually worked when they are well operated? What are the attributes of that? Right. That was kind of the question. And that the reason for asking that question is if we can find some nuggets of information in that, then maybe we can think about things slightly differently. And you're obviously right, Steve. The area that we can influence is in the technology and the products. but understanding the problems, the way people are trying to solve it without the technology is sort of one way of learning.
And I would also argue we're kind of, with the products, I think most people are heading on that flight path anyway. You know, the interoperability, the access to information, the data, you know, those kind of technical barriers are being broken down now anyway. So it's you can take a horse to water, you can't make him drink. You got to actually, you know, you could have the best products all enabled to do everything, but you still got to have that you know, someone driving it.
I agree, Roger.
we
I'm just suggesting that the channel partners like, you know, a CBRE or a large MSI, they're in a position to be the drivers or the organizations that can make that
Where I've
pitch
seen
to
it
the owner.
working to go,
Yeah.
so where I've seen it working, to go back to your thing, and so is that in a smaller way, it's where the owner has engaged an MSI. And the MSI is also kind of being engaged by the consultant and the contractor, because they need someone who understands both sides. And that's when it's worked, because the owner was smart enough to know what he wanted, but couldn't on a day-to-day basis deal with the consultants and mechanical contractors because it wasn't his job. But the MSI helped kind of bring that, you know, to the front, to be able to actually say, look, this is what's really needed, and have the ears of both sides.
And it seems that Ken earlier sort of had the magic answer to that. Is I think somewhere in your explanation of the president that you were working for, you were saying that the emphasis or the priority is for the operations, right?
Correct. Actually, the other interesting thing was to get it into a measured variable. And what we chose as our measured variable was client comfort. But also we had energy per square unit, and we had other parameters. But in the final analysis, we have to turn ourselves into a process. And really the big one is client comfort. And we tried to do client comfort calculations with the first DDC systems. And of course, we were working with microprocessors that were pretty dumb. And we didn't have like analytics packages like Jim's selling. So with the kind of analytics we have now, I think that can be a real driving force. And ultimately, that's got to be what it is we're selling, is comfort, and it's comfort has been redefined as desirability and sustainability to get the people back into the zombie buildings is being defined here in today's things. So anyway, I think that's important, is to create a measured variable that you can actually measure this with, and
across the different grades, across the different things that's happening in the building.
Yeah, I think so.
It's basically bullet number 3 without necessarily saying it that way.
Yeah.
Makes stuff work. It's really probably words that would be used with each other.
the other thing you can do is then, once you have these measured variables that everybody agrees and supports, you can then look at other facilities. And that gave us the money to upgrade. So the facilities that were performing poorly stood out like sore thumbs, and said, what's wrong with this building? And then, of course, the other thing that showed up is that the heritage buildings knocked the socks off of all the brand new buildings because of all of their fancy systems running out of control. So it was a lot of it was trying to get some of the new designs closer to the designs of 40 and 50 years old, which were always in the portfolio as well. So yeah, just having a measurement thing. Every one of my early ventures were based on energy analysis. We were just working off of utility data back in those days. We saw the value of meters. We started moving more and more. I actually remember our first interface to the utility meter at the university was a closed circuit TV camera, and we basically just put it on the meter and watched the meter So we'd be working there and we'd look up and we could actually see the meter for the university.
Interoperable. And it is because
Jumps over a few new standards, actually. Yeah. We often found that the video and in too many stories. But I
okay, so
do
where did
believe
this
turning it into a measured variable of some sort, ever what it is that we all agree
Yeah.
on is important.
Yeah, I think I'm with Ken on this one, and that's some of the stuff that we're working on too. You know, how do you actually measure this stuff at the end of the day? What's the measures, right? But you know, to Jim's point, I do find, Ken, that the measures might be different for the different domains. You know,
Yeah.
a hospital
yeah.
to a
Yeah.
school, their measures
Yeah.
are different,
We
but that's
learned
okay.
that.
Recognizing the measures is important.
Don't shut off the air conditioning in the courtroom. Learned that real quick. Contempt of court.
Yeah, and don't make it rain in an operating theater.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely some rules out there.
Yeah.
Or don't kill 50,000 fish.
Yeah.
That's another one. Another no.
So what do we learn from this conversation as we're starting to wrap? You know, obviously, if you start with an objective of having a building that is operated well, that's going to give you
I think the
an
big thing
advantage.
is to understand the purpose of the building. Because that really changes it. You know, Jim does a lot of work in pharmaceutical, and that's a completely different thing. And even classrooms are different. Operating theaters, courthouses, what the building was designed for is what it needs to be operated as. And a lot of our operators don't really understand that whole requirement of the building, why the building is there. And so that has to be there, and out of that has to come some kind of measured variables that we as control people can deal with, because we can't deal with those silly people. They're impossible. But give us a measured variable and we can control to it.
Well, I think it's like you were saying, Anto, at the beginning, right? That we have this focus on building operations, right? Which is a different focus than just making buildings smart for the sake of making buildings smart, right? What we're really focused on now is the operations. I think we're just starting to touch on a lot of that good subject as we go through. And I think that was one of our realizations on our earlier call last week, right? In that the term OT, operational technology, in some context, we've missed an opportunity to really focus on that value of OT, you know, and we, you know, for the sake of the audience, we brought up this discussion on our Wednesday call in that, you know, we used OT to basically differentiate ourselves from IT to help the IT guys highlight the fact that what we deal with is different to IT technologies, which was good for a purpose. But in reality, the term OT actually bears a lot of value when you really start to think about it, right? And that what our stuff, it actually conveys the message of what we're talking about here. We're bringing technology for operations, and hence the term operational technologies. Now, I think there's a great value in messaging that stronger, right? That OT is more than just a differentiation to IT. It actually is a significant thing in of itself, right?
Okay, back to the well-operated buildings too, just something that jumped into my mind as I left the conversation. I want to go back to that, is what was a well-operated building is changing so rapidly with decarbonization, electrification, microgrid interface, just basically trying to interface with the utilities. This is a complex array of stuff that even the best building operator who knew how to operate the building quite well is facing radical change, and he needs an update. He needs to understand all of these parameters. So it's a tough job to try and keep on top of all of this stuff.
I was just thinking back, there's a great example of this on a much smaller scale, if you take one of the things I worked on in the States was the Wawa gas stations.
Oh, yeah.
And you know, they initially had and it was the owner and everyone, they were totally engaged with the implementation of a system in each store. And the sort of information they got out of it, they suddenly started realizing was more valuable for their operations than it was just the energy, because they started monitoring the tanks for the fuel. And then they were saying, they would open that up to the fuel guys and saying, hey, just don't turn up every Monday with God knows what, how much fuel. Just bring the right stuff for me, once every other week or whatever we need. Then they were able to see what was going on with the car wash. They were able to see that doors were open on the drinks machines. Suddenly this whole thing became a really fantastically operated store, but it was initially put in to turn the lights on and off, to actually manage the air conditioner and things like that. And it really made that, one of those lines there, the actionable information, fantastic beyond what they initially felt. But that was driven by Wawa themselves actually having that vision of what they wanted out of their store.
I do want to go back to my opening comment, Roger, in that Wawa thing. Was there one particular guy that kind of was the...
Yeah, it was driven by a key individual.
Yeah.
But it then got inbred
Yeah.
further into the organization because they saw the success of it. And it affected their operations, not just the energy part of it.
Yeah.
In the early days, I was taken to a building in Sydney, Australia, and it was a really early full implementation of room control. And once they had the room control and they knew which rooms were occupied, the cleaning staff took over. It became way more valuable to the hotel, the fact that they knew who was in what rooms. And so the whole cleaning schedule, which used to have them work floor by floor, got changed to being task orientated to which rooms are empty. And and that was early days, that whole integration. So yes, agree with you totally, Roger.
Yeah, hotels are a good example too.
More data you have, the better operations you can have.
Well, the data gets used for different stuff, and then it creates value, becomes more of another measured variable. Is how much information do we know is another measured variable we need.
And that hotel is a good example again, because it's when they're hooked up to the booking system that they can actually manage the hotel that much better. How many rooms do they have booked, and and so on.
Yeah. And I think if Tracy was here, he would tell some amazing stories.
For sure.
From a restaurant's perspective, yeah, I think that's great. Okay, so we're past 4 o'clock, so we're going to bring this to a wrap. I think this has been a great conversation, and we'll continue the conversation on OT for next couple of weeks. So with that, let's wrap. We'll get a video on this tomorrow or Wednesday. Otherwise, have a great week, and we'll see you next week.
See you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.